Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the INFP and the INFJ. I specifically wanted to compare them because these two types often have the same Enneagram type, which can be one reason for why they can seem very similar to each other sometimes, despite these types having very different functions. Technically, they share no cognitive functions. Their four main functions are all different, and INFPs lead with a feeling function, whereas INFJs lead with an intuition function. So their dominant function is also very different. But of course, they are both INF types, so they're both introverts, they're both pretty idealistic, creative, because of intuition, and they are both feelers, so they're both really interested in people and understanding them. And they also have some similar weaknesses, such as extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking, which are things that they are not great at. And, in terms of the functions. And then I want to talk about this similarity where both of them can actually act pretty unconventional because introverted feeling, for INFPs, it's all about kind of living according to their own values, their own morals, they're going to be very focused on how they feel about things and always kind of follow their heart, which means that they're usually pretty individualistic and they'll always do their own thing even if other people don't agree with them. So this can make them stand out. And for intuition in general, it's the same thing. Intuition usually doesn't really care about conventions. It doesn't really care too much about what people around them are doing. It kind of just wants to be creative and do its own thing. So a dominant intuitive might also always seem unconventional. So an INFJ might as well. And there's another similarity where they can both be very determined as well, but in different ways. The INFPs, and also everyone with dominant introvert feeling, so also the ISFPs, can seem very determined to always live by their values, no matter what other people say, And they can have also this emotional investment in it, so they can also seem very like they feel emotional about it. For INFJs, which they also have in common with INTJs, can also seem determined simply because of their introvert intuition, which is very kind of goal driven and future focused. So all the intuitive functions can be pretty future focused. So extroverted intuition as well. For introverted intuition, it's kind of like they just attach themselves way more to their future possibilities. They kind of attach themselves to it, and extrovert intuitives don't care as much. It's not very personal for them. Their goals are less personal than for INTJs and INFJs, so they can actually seem very determined to reach goals or to reach a certain ideal, or maybe not even to reach it, but just to get closer to a goal or to an ideal. Which means that that's why both INFJs and INFPs can seem determined. Generally, INFJs are going to be a bit more logic focused. They also use introverted thinking, whereas INFPs don't use their thinking functions that much. They're a bit more emotional and they also use introverted sensing, which is something that INFJs don't really use. So that's also a big difference. INFJs are more imaginative and they are going to appreciate logical explanations for things more. And INFPs are more emotional as well as more grounded in reality, since they like revisiting their past memories. Also, INFJs are going to come across as much more agreeable than INFPs. It can kind of show itself in INFPs kind of going their own way, no matter what other people think, and then INFJs wanting to go their own way, kind of because of that introverted intuition, having their own way of seeing things, but not always living by it because they are afraid of what other people would think, and they still really try to adapt their behavior to what is socially expected, even if that's not really what they want. So, the interesting thing is that INFPs can seem agreeable, even though they aren't, because they will be agreeable in terms of maybe what they say, but not in what they do. This is because whenever they don't listen to someone because something doesn't align with their values, they will simply be as polite about it as possible. If they are one of those INFPs who like to avoid conflict, which apparently is quite common for them, they usually have good social understanding, which they can use to their advantage like this. If someone doesn't let them be themselves, then they may not necessarily start a fight about it. They might just decide to quietly walk away and distance themselves from that person. Both of these types are apparently quite likely to be Enneagram type 4. Enneagram type 4 is very associated with identity. And this is a reason why it's also usually associated with introverted feeling, because that's a function that's very associated with identity and discovering who you are and what you care about and that kind of stuff. But it's also focused on kind of wanting people to see your identity. So fours, they are also very introverted. They also usually feel they're different from most people and like there's kind of like a wall between them and others. And for some reason, they find it really hard to connect with other people, which makes them in turn feel like there's something wrong with them, like they are kind of flawed in many ways. So they kind of feel like people look at them and they only see their flaws. Then fours start kind of trying to look inwards and figuring out who they are and find things about themselves that are valuable, positive things. And then they feel like if they show that to people, if they manage to show that by always being being who they think they are, then maybe people will actually value them because they might see that they're not only flawed, that there's also good things about them, you know? And twos and threes are Enneagram types that have the same problem of feeling like they can't be loved, but they deal with it in very different ways. So twos try to help people as much as possible, and threes try to just achieve as many things as possible. So they are both a bit more focused on their behavior, like what they do, and maybe for the fours, they are more focused on their identity because they are usually quite introverted. And then I feel like maybe the reason why INFJs and INFPs often become fours is also because their functions can make them feel different from other people. Because I don't really know when exactly your Enneagram type is determined and your MBTI type. But I feel like for me, when I was like a child, there were already kind of signs of certain functions. But I never really had, I feel like my Enneagram type wasn't really clear at that point. So that makes me feel like maybe the Enneagram types comes later. If that's true, then maybe an INFJ will kind of feel different from others because they're introverted, because of their introverted intuition, because they kind of see the world in a different way than a lot of people do. And they're also quite introverted. And then for INFPs, because of their introverted feeling, it's like they know themselves so well that the differences between them and others become very clear, you know, because some people don't care too much about who they are. They can kind of just decide I'm going to be like the people around me so that I can fit in because they're not that focused on their own identity. So when you are an introverted feeler and you're always focused on your identity, you might start wondering why are other people not doing the same thing? And if they are also introvert feelers, then you're still going to be acting very different from each other because you're never going to try to kind of change your behavior because of what's expected. You're always going to still be yourself. And the problem is that means that you're just very aware of your differences, because no person is the same as anyone else. One reason why these types may not feel very valued by others is because they can be looked down upon for being very sensitive. INFJs struggle with being sensitive to sensory input, also to emotional input, and INFPs struggle with their own strong emotions, and both of them are usually highly socially aware and empathic. And when I say that, I don't mean that other types can't be empathic. It's just that, most people have like this basic sense of empathy, but certain types can have this like to the extreme, like amplified, where it really can actually bother them in their life, that they kind of feel like they are too sensitive to how others are feeling. And especially INFJs, because they can't really shut it off. Whereas INFPs have this capacity, but they can usually choose if they want to empathize with someone or not. If an INFJ grows up in a surrounding with a lot of extroverts or a lot of sensors, they might also feel like they can't connect. But then for INTJs, they might also have the same problem as INFJs. But they're usually apparently 5s, Enneagram type 5. But I guess that's probably because for some reason 4s are often feelers. So maybe they're just not focused enough on feeling. And instead they are more focused on knowledge. They can still have like a 4 wing though if they're a 5. But imagine you have an INFJ 4 and an INFP 4. How are you going to tell them apart, right? It's this thing where I feel like INFJ 4s, they always try to have an idea of who they are and of what their identity is. And they kind of often check in with that and kind of be like, okay, who am I again? And they try to live by it. But for them, it's kind of a complicated puzzle or something. It's like difficult to figure it out sometimes, because it's not necessarily their natural thing, because they don't have strong introverted feeling. Like, introverted feeling is not necessarily one of their weaknesses, but it's also not one of their strengths. It's just something that they don't really do, and instead they're just more focused on extroverted feeling. So it can be difficult for them to know how they feel about things. It can be difficult to know what their values are. So it might take a while for them to really figure that out. Whereas for INFPs, it's kind of their natural way of being, kind of just always knowing how they feel about everything and always being focused on themselves. Which means I think that INFP 4s have a more in-depth sense of identity, because they're just always focused on it. And for INFJs, it's more like they have an idea of it, but it might be a bit less intricate. For me, it's kind of like I have these core values that I feel like I need to live by, and just, few things about myself that I feel like, oh, those are good things, so I should kind of focus on developing these good things about myself and kind of showing them to people. But I feel like the thing is that we don't know how we feel about everything. We just don't. Whereas INFPs probably do. Because INFPs always base their decisions on their values. They have a strong will, which INFJs don't really have. It's like INFJs, I feel like we can have strong opinions, but we often don't act on them because we can be very agreeable, even if we don't want to be, And the thing is, INFPs are dominant judgers. They have a judging function as their dominant function. So INFPs are going to judge things, like have an opinion on things all the time, which also makes them seem like strong-willed, So I think, at least for me, what I'm usually focused on is not necessarily always discovering myself more, even though that's something that we do want to do, but it's not something that introverted intuition is naturally very focused on. because it's not focused on us a lot. It's more focused on understanding and on truth and that kind of stuff. And on future stuff, just planning stuff. That's why I feel like, at least for me, I'm more focused on how to live like myself, and then why I should live a certain way in order to live according to my core values or my identity, kind of figuring out what's the ideal way to live. And then we kind of gather this knowledge of understanding things, and we use that to live more like ourselves and more aligned with the things we care about. So we kind of base our future goals, kind of base them on our identity, but we're still more focused on the goals and the how and why behind things. Because we're often just very focused on ideals, like what's the ideal way to live? What does the ideal world look like? And just like trying to get closer to those ideals. So for us, these ideals may be kind of based on our identity or based on our values. And yeah, and besides that, we're just also very focused on understanding other people. So naturally, we're not always going to be focused on ourselves. But to us, it's still important that we kind of know who we are, even if we're not always trying to discover that further. But we do kind of need to have a bit of a grip on it. And for me, that's very important, because whenever I feel like I don't have a sense of identity, and whenever I feel like I'm not being myself, I can just feel really bad about that and kind of feel almost kind of like feel like it's the end of the world, like it's the worst thing ever, you know? So I feel like that's kind of strange, right? So it's like it's really important. And it makes sense because apparently it's so important to us, because we feel like if we don't do that, we're not lovable, basically. So yeah, INFJs do try to figure out their identity, but it comes less natural to us than for INFPs. It's like we have to put conscious effort into that. Understanding other people and connecting with them comes more natural to us, which leads to us kind of probably having different problems in our life. So I feel like what INFJs will have the most problems with? No. What INFJs will struggle with the most is kind of not being themselves, you know? Because it's like we have this voice kind of telling us, like, you have to know who you are and you have to live by that. And your people are going to hate you if you don't, or they're going to dislike you if you don't. But because of our extroverted feeling and introverted thinking, we may not always do that. And our natural tendency is kind of to just making decisions based on what other people expect from us. And if we don't do that, then we're just going to make decisions based on what we think makes logical sense. And sometimes we can live by our logical reasons and then kind of end up living a life in which we are not really taking care of our own emotions, because apparently logic was more important, you know? Yeah, I feel that's the reason why INFJs might making decisions kind of on autopilot with extroverted feeling and introverted thinking. And then after they made a decision, realizing like, oh, I feel like this decision didn't really align with my values, and then feeling bad about it. And then I feel for INFPs, it's more like they kind of have less of a struggle with being themselves because they have such a strong will. They're naturally just more focused on themselves. But they may have a bigger struggle with people and kind of people misunderstanding them because they act on their own values. But to other people, it might seem like they're being selfish. They might think, oh, you don't care about other people, you only care about yourself, you know? So one difference between INFPs who are fours and INFPs who are not fours might be that the INFPs who are fours are going to try harder to show their identity to people in some way. And they want people to understand that their identity is valuable, and what they're doing is valuable. Yeah, so those INFPs who are fours might be really interested in forms of self-expression, kind of expressing themselves through something, maybe, like through a work of art or through the way they dress, anything like that. So for INFJs, it might be a lot easier to communicate those things because they generally always kind of are trying their best more to connect with people and only act on a few core values, and with any other decisions they'll just go along with other people. They're just much more agreeable in general. That was kind of an overview of how INFJs and INFPs can seem similar or different. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.